Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I stand on behalf of the Green Party to speak to the Reserve Bank Covered Bonds Bill. What this bill does, in a nutshell, is it facilitates and regulates the ability of the New Zealand banks to borrow from overseas. That's the essence of the bill. And that should be a worry. For people who are concerned about the increasing indebtedness of the New Zealand economy as a whole, what this bill is a reflection of is that the New Zealand banks are having to go further overseas in order to borrow more money to fund our current account deficit. But I wanted to focus, before I get on to the general problem around the current account deficit, I wanted to start with some of the specific concerns why depositors in banks should be interested in this bill. The reason, if you have a deposit in a bank, in a New Zealand bank, you should be interested in this bill because it means that other people, if the bank goes belly up, other people will get access to the bank's assets before you. That's what a covered bond means. So when the banks want to borrow from overseas, what they'll be doing is going to overseas lenders and saying, we want to borrow some money. The lenders will say, OK, we'll lend you money, but what's the asset? What's the mortgage, if you like, against which we're going to lend you the money. And what the bank will do is put up an asset, some of its assets, which are basically going to be housing loans. The New Zealand bank will put up an asset and say, look, we'll borrow money off you, and if we go belly up, you get this asset. What that means, however, is that if the bank goes belly up, it means that the New Zealand depositors are not first in the queue to access those assets. That is fundamentally what a covered bond means. It gives priority in the queue of creditors to whoever loaned the money to the bank for this covered bond. So that means that the depositors are not first in the queue to access those assets if the bank goes bad. That is a significant development. Now, what we found out through the course of the Select Committee inquiry is that this is already happening. Speaking for myself, I was unaware of it, but the covered bond market was already developing in New Zealand. The banks were already engaged in this practice. So in some respects, we are regulating a practice that has already started. And so we're going to be supporting the bill because we think it's essential that we do. But I think it is important to understand what is happening here. We are so far down the debt track as a country, not talking about the fiscal position of the government, but talking about the country as a whole. We're so far down the debt track that now we're advancing into these new ways of borrowing money from the rest of the world to fund our current account deficit. But that means that if the banks go belly up, that the depositors will not be first in the queue to access the bank's assets. And so it does put depositors' money at risk as a result. Now, of course, it does facilitate the banks accessing this money, and so does add some stability to the banking system in that respect, but there is a downside to it and we need to be aware of it. It's important that there is a limit on how much of the bank's assets, what proportion of the bank's assets they can borrow through the covered bond market. Because whatever is that, and it's set at 10% currently by the Reserve Bank, because whatever is that proportion, that's the proportion of the bank's assets that depositors won't have access to if the bank goes belly up. And when we if a bank goes belly up and we try to fix it. I think the bigger policy issue is really, that sits behind this bill, of course, is the problem of the current account deficit. The reason why, of course, the banks are continually going to the international market to borrow more and more money is because we're running a large current account deficit. Over the last decade, basically the banks have been borrowing money overseas and shuffling it through to the private housing market. Aside from the credit that the New Zealand banks have created themselves, they've also been borrowing from overseas. And they've been passing that through into the housing market. And we've seen this dramatic expansion in the housing market in New Zealand fuelled by this cheap credit. Of course, the price of housing in New Zealand doubled between 2002 and 2007. And so that housing market inflation is one of our problems and is one of the reasons we're borrowing all this money. And it's also part of the bigger picture of why we continue to have a current account deficit. And the current account deficit is projected to increase to 6.5% of GDP by 2017, according to Treasury. That is a very large and very unsustainable current account deficit. So if we don't have the policies in place to address that current account deficit, We won't just need the Reserve Bank of New Zealand covered bonds amendment bill, we're going to need a whole stack of measures to borrow more and more and more money from the rest of the world to fund our current account deficit as a country. Now, the government seems pretty happy about that. Originally, when they first got into office, they weren't happy about that. They said we had to rebalance the economy. Now, rebalancing the economy, there's many metrics for rebalancing the economy, but probably the single key metric is the current account deficit. So initially, Bill English quite rightly said we need to deal with this problem. Of course, since he's been in government, the problem has only gotten worse because the current account deficit continues to grow. It went very high during the Labor government, and that was a huge problem. Then it dropped dramatically during the GFC, and now it's steadily rising again. And as we undermine the export and tradable sector with our very high currency, which the government insists they must do nothing about, that very high currency is creating tremendous problems for our exporters and manufacturers, and that means that our current account deficit is going to get worse. Because if we can't trade our way out because our currency is overvalued, IMF says the currency is overvalued 15%, it's probably more than that by now, then our current account deficit will only get worse. It also means, because of the high New Zealand dollar, that imports are cheap. So we buy lots of imports. It also means that businesses in New Zealand that are competing with imports are being driven out of business. And as we knock out these businesses that are fundamental to our tradable sector, we are making our current account deficit worse, and that means that we have to borrow more and more money from the rest of the world or sell assets to the rest of the world, because there's only two ways to fund the current account deficit, short of quantitative easing. There's only two ways to fund a current account deficit, and that's by borrowing from the world, which this bill facilitates, or it's by selling assets, whether it's the Crayford Farms, whether it's the one that the Canadians recently bought. You can sell your land. And so essentially, when the government says it's happy with its current policy settings, what it means is that it's happy selling more and more land and assets into overseas ownership to fund the current account deficit. What the government's saying is that it's happy with a situation where we're borrowing more and more from the rest of the world in order to fund the current account deficit. Now, the problem with the government strategy down that respect is that once you borrow the money, you have to not only pay back the original, the money you borrowed, you have to service the loan, the interest payments, which means that adds yet more burden on the export sector, which is the ones that have to pay this interest. And once you sell all these assets, the profits that come out of the assets, whether it's the farms or other kinds of assets, the profits that come out, they go overseas to the owners, because that's why they bought those assets. The foreign owners were interested in buying those assets in order to access the profits that come from them. Those profits then travel overseas and add to your current account deficit. So it becomes an ever more difficult problem to solve the longer you run a large current account deficit. And the problem for New Zealand is we're going further and further down that track. So we have this bill in front of us, which at one level is a rational response to the situation we're in. We're trying to facilitate and regulate borrowing more money from overseas via the banking system through covered bonds. It is a rational response to the immediate situation we're in. The Greens will support it for that reason. It is not a rational long-term solution to the challenges facing the New Zealand economy. And so the government might get through this bill or whatever, and it kind of says, oh, well, we'll carry on. People can still afford cheap flat-screen TVs. But the way that we're affording cheap flat-screen TVs is we're borrowing the money and we're selling our assets to the rest of the world. I tell you, that is not a sustainable strategy. That is why the Greens have been pushing unorthodox in New Zealand policies such as lowering the OCR, using loan-to-valuation ratios to control housing inflation so we can have a lower official cash rate to put downward pressure on the exchange rate, unorthodox policies like quantitative easing in order to pay for the Christchurch rebuild, because we think it is critical that we deal with the problem of the current account deficit. And anyone that wants to have a glib debate about printing money or all the rest of it, which is all we've really got from the government, or Shamabil Yacob from the government's favourite economist, those people who want to have that glib debate aren't dealing with the real fundamental challenges that are facing us. If we don't deal with the current account deficit, we have no choice but to borrow more money. We have no choice but to sell further assets. And a government that doesn't want to deal with that problem is a government that is not working in the long-term interests of New Zealand. We'll support this bill because it gets us through where we are now, but let's be absolutely clear, we need solutions to the problems we face.
Mr. Speaker.
John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the Labor and the Greens and New Zealand First are trying to talk our economy